Hi there, welcome back to Language Professora. You know the drill by now. We are looking at our grade 7 Jamaican literature text, and we are now at chapter 6. The title of chapter 6, Left for Kingston. There are several things happening in this chapter. However, because the chapter is pretty short, I kept it as one plot running throughout rather than breaking it up like I did with chapter 2. So at the beginning of chapter 6, we see Frank's mother sending for him to come to her in Kingston. He packs up his bag, his belongings, and based on what we see him packing, that gives you some indication as to, again, the era in which this story is set, right? I keep asking about that. I want you to pay attention to those little details. He catches the early bus and he heads into Kingston. Now, the bus driver stops along the way and, they're going to a bar, they have some drinks. The passengers get a bit restive and they begin to grumble. Some things are said. Pay attention to the dialogue. Some things are said. Eventually the driver comes out. He's upset that the people interrupted his little bar time, and he begins to drive quite recklessly. Eventually he stops and the bus gets to Kingston, right? But why did he stop driving so recklessly? There's a conversation that takes place that kind of gives you a clue to that. When Frank gets to Kingston, he's a little bit nervous. He doesn't show it much, but he is a little bit nervous. And if you think about it, this is a boy who, when we met him at the beginning of the book, he was 13 years old. We know time has passed. Let us add on maybe a year or two to his age. So he's maybe now about 15, maybe going into 16 years old, right? He has been in the country all his life. This is a brand new experience for him. So I want you to put yourself in Frank's shoes. If you have been accustomed to a particular way of life all your life, and all of a sudden you're in a brand new environment, how would you react? So Frank is at the bus stop waiting for his mother. And because he's not familiar, he does a particular thing. What is it that he does? It's something very simple, not rocket science, right? But he does a particular thing because he's not familiar. And the emotions that are racing through him as well while he waits for his mother. Eventually he sees her coming, and there is something immediately that he is about to do, and she tells him that's not how we do it here in Kingston. So right away, I'm just doing a little bit of foreshadowing to a theme. We see urban versus rural clashing. What is it that Frank was about to do and his mother told him not to do it because that's not how it is done in Kingston? Eventually they get to another bus stop and something again happens that he's not accustomed to. So you see the things, they're kind of rolling into each other. This whole new environment, the unfamiliarity with some things, it's already rolling into each other. So there's something that his mother did when they got on the second bus that was unfamiliar to him. What was it that she did? Eventually they get to her house. It's in the afternoon. Let's check the timeline. He left country from early in the morning. They get to her house in the afternoon in Kingston. That's a pretty long journey. And it speaks to the era in Jamaica that they're living in. Because if you think about right now, it takes you 3 hours from Kingston to Montego Bay? Not even a whole morning. But this journey took a while. So it's telling you something about the era in Jamaica. I keep telling you about that. So just pay attention to it, okay? Anyway, they get to her house in the afternoon and she again warns him. Little boy, this is not country, right? I'm just paraphrasing, imagining how she would have said it. He meets two boys who live in the yard, and it's a typical tenement yard setup. You can do a little bit of research into that if you're not quite familiar with the term. He meets two boys, Mark and Junior, and boys will be boys. They get friendly and they play a game of cricket. and there's another clash between rural and urban. Something happens, and Frank is made aware of the difference again between being in the country and being in town. What is it that happens that makes that difference come alive? His mother comes home either that evening or one evening. As I said, the timeline is a bit hazy, with a very skinny dog. And Frank immediately takes a dislike to the dog because his mother is paying it all of this attention. Now, there is a clincher in terms of an event that takes place where his mother was eating, not necessarily at the same time that she brought the dog home. So you can go and look at the timeline there. But she was eating and they get into an argument over a bone that he wanted, and she wanted to give it to the dog instead. So we see another child-parent relationship dynamic coming into play. I don't think I have it in my themes list at the end of this, but I'm just mentioning it now. And it is reminiscent of what the relationship was like back in the country between Frank and his mother, where she thought more of the dog than her own child. That's a little bit sad, isn't it? Anyway, they argue over the bone and she throws a plate at him. He runs out of the yard. He is walking for a little while and he eventually runs into Mark and Junior, and all three of them continue walking. Anywhere Frank goes, he finds two male friends, doesn't he? Remember, back in the country, it was Nathan and Daniel. They come across two girls and, they're putting conversation to them. Again, this sort of tells you about the age that they might be by now. Because 13 years old, you're still a little bit of a child, innocent. But getting up into the mid-teens, you begin to become more forthright with conversing with females. So they were trying to get them to have a conversation. The girls refused. This created a conflict. Remember, conflict, any problem. You have two ways of addressing a potential conflict. You either walk away or you do something that makes the conflict become even more. So Junior exposes himself to them. They were disrespecting him by not responding to him. And that's how he chose to respond. They run inside screaming. They don't think anything of it and they continue to walk. But they soon hear somebody shouting for them to stop. More conflict. Now let us do a little bit of backtracking. One of the things that you will realize with a story, the driving force behind the conflict is that it snowballs into other potential issues down the line. So if Junior had not exposed himself, then this gentleman would not be shouting for them to stop. If they had just kept walking, there would be no more conflict. But Junior did what he did, so more conflict develops. They run away and they think they have gotten away. Now, this is kind of similar to chapter 5, where they think that something is over and done with, but it really isn't, because something else is happening that they're unaware of. And while they're walking along on their merry way, the father has gone to the police and the police are now involved. So we have some suspense being added to the mix. So while they're walking along, minding their own business, and several cars by now would have passed them and, they didn't pay it any attention. All of a sudden, there's this vehicle that stops. And when they look, lo and behold, the father and the police. They give chase and the boys, of course, run off, but this is like your climax to this particular conflict. The boys run off and they get away, they head back home. That's your resolution right there for that situation. Back at home now, Frank's mother has calmed down. She initially had planned to send him back to the country, but by the next morning she calmed down and she tells him that she's going to send him to learn a skill. Now, Frank makes a decision. Okay, since I'm not going back home, me and this dog not going to live in this yard, right? The dog and I, we're not going to be staying here together. So he decides that he's going to get rid of the dog. When his mother leaves, he drags the dog out of the yard. not in a very pleasant way. I won't belabor that point. When she returns that evening, the dog is nowhere to be found, of course. Suspense is building because we know what Frank has done, but she does not. So there's a bit of suspense. She asks, no one seems to know, including Frank. Later in the night, she hears a dog barking, but it's not Rex. But that is sort of like a climactic area of the event where everything built up to that point, because we were maybe wondering, is Rex going to come back? Did Rex die? Did she find Rex? Did anybody find Rex? So in the night when we hear the dog barking, that's a bit of a climax. And our resolution to that is Rex was never seen again. Now I'm stopping the plot here, but chapter 6 does not end here. There is something else that takes place that I am going to leave for you in the questions. But let's look at the other elements first. We have Frank, we have the passengers on the bus, the driver, Mrs. Grant, Mark Jr., the girls and their father, the police, and Rex. Remember, we think about our characters as being major and minor based on the impact that they have on the overall plot and the conflict. So think about how all of these characters fuse into the overall plot. Our setting, we started in the countryside, but the majority of the chapter is set in Kingston. Of course, some time has elapsed. I would say a couple of weeks have elapsed. It's taking place between morning and night. We're not given any idea in terms of a season. Is it summer? Is it a regular? Because we can't even assume that it's summer, because we don't know Mark and Junior's situation, if they are finished with school, if it's a weekend that they were playing cricket. We don't know, so we can't make any assumptions. Our theme, our major theme here, is rural versus urban. It's the first time that we're seeing this theme pop up, and I want you to pay attention to it, because it in the Jamaican history, it sort of gives you an idea as to the era in which the story is set, and I keep mentioning that. And you also want to do some close comparisons between what life is like in the rural communities of Jamaica and what life is like in the urban areas of Jamaica. Of course, we have friendship. Frank is always finding friends. We see sexuality popping up. In that little incident with Junior, we see that popping up. And we also see animal cruelty. A couple questions I have for you to answer, and I mentioned this. How is the theme of rural versus urban evident in this chapter? Now, how you approach a question like this, you have to identify all the elements in the plot, all the components of the plot that highlight the rural, and then you go and you do all the elements or the components that highlight the urban. And what you can then do is compare, are there any similarities between these components? You can go, point by point. Are there any similarities? Or you can contrast, are there any differences between the two? What do you think of Junior's actions towards the girls? What do you think? Was it something good? Was it something bad? And whatever you think, why do you think what you think? What do you think would have happened if the police had caught them? That's another question. And finally, I mentioned that I didn't do the last part of the chapter deliberately. What is the trigger, that thing that sets events in action? What is the trigger that sends Frank back to the country? As usual, happy reading.